Salam Hadia. Hi, thank you so much for joining me to talk about your wonderful book, Rebellious Wives, Neglectful Husbands, Controversies in Modern Qur'anic Commentaries, which I thoroughly enjoyed and am so grateful it exists. And like I was just telling you, it makes me like certain people more and certain people less than I did previously. And I look forward to our conversation on this. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to discuss the book with you today.
Yeah. Let's now talk about 4.3 on polygyny. What kinds of departures do we find here from the pre-modern and modern scholars? And I have to say, I really appreciated, especially the discussion that you're, the discussion and the fact that the pre-modern scholars focus more on the connection between the orphans, because the verse literally reads, and I'm going to pull it up here. If you fear that you might not treat the orphans justly, then marry the women that seem good to you in 2s and 3s and 4s. And if you fear that you won't be treat them justly, then marry only one, right? And I'd always wondered about this connection between orphans and polygyny. And I was hoping at least somebody would go, hold on, guys. This is clearly talking only to the folks who are legal guardians of the orphans, and so not just any of you. So if you are not responsible if you're not a guardian for an orphan, then this verse does not apply to you, and you cannot have multiple wives. But nobody was doing that. And so, but I did, it was a very interesting point that the pre-modern scholars are trying so hard to figure out this connection, and the more modern folks have other issues, and they're responding to the colonial discussions on polygyny as it's the worst thing that the Muslims have, and so on. And so would love to hear more thoughts on that.
Exactly what you said. The modern exegetes and the way they approach verse 4.3, I think is one of the greatest illustrations of the fact that modernity really incites this new discourse among religious scholars, specifically Muslim religious scholars, on this question of women and gender, because of the fact and because of the need to respond to the colonial charges against Islam as being sort of like an impediment to women's progress, by colonial administrators, right? Like in North Africa, who were actively, who viewed Islam as this sort of like very patriarchal religion that was also very disempowering to women. But what's also interesting is, so they're not only responding to this, but they're also responding to, secular Muslim critiques of Islam, specifically with Sayyid Qutb, I would say the most. And whereas Ibn Ashur, so the first two, because they were earlier, obviously, Abdul and Rida are for the most part responding to Western criticism, whereas Qutb is responding to secular criticism of this verse and other verses. And Ibn Ashur is really in many ways responding to the tradition itself, and he views himself as a corrective to the Muslim tradition. And you kind of see this, the weight, the ideological weight that women and gender issues carry in the modern period. You see this specifically in the way they talk about polygyny, and for all of them, they're trying to sort of rationalize, like, why did God allow for polygyny to exist? Which is really interesting when you compare it to the pre-modern exegetes, because they're trying to figure out why God limited. It was really interesting, just fascinating to see the difference. The pre-modern mufassirin are saying, why did God limit men's multiple marriages to 4? And the idea is, well, because of justice. And reading the commentaries in great detail completely changed the way I actually view this verse now. It's exactly what you mentioned, that they actually didn't see this specifically for pre-modern exegetes. This verse was not about polygyny at all, because polygyny was a pre-existing practice. Rather, they viewed this verse as, obliging justice in various ways. Most importantly, first, justice to female orphans, and the fact that a guardian should not marry a female orphan under his care because of the conflict of interest that would create. And so that was where they saw that connection between what is the connection here between fear of injustice to orphans and multiple marriages. And that was one of the most important questions for them to try to figure out. And so it was for them, it was not about trying to explain why does Islam allow polygyny, right? Which is very much like the modern approach to this verse. It's like, we're trying to like rationalize why God allowed polygyny. And so, especially with Rashid Rida, Sayyid Qutb, and even Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, they're coming up with like logical reasons to try to explain why God, had, allowed for this pre-existing institution, if you will, right, that predates Islam, obviously. So that was really the main shift with the modern exegetes. But at the same time, there were so many aspects of this, of the commentaries on this verse that really completely changed the way I look at it. Because as you know, in Muslim societies, we tend to look at 4:3 as a verse that allows for a Muslim male to engage in multiple marriages, and it wasn't that straightforward for even the pre-modern exegetes. It was more like the central objective of this verse was to implement justice. And I believe it was At-Tabari, who went as far as saying something to the extent that, if a man can't be just to even one wife, he shouldn't get married. And that's where I argue that there was an indirect case made for monogamy by Ibn Ashur and some of the other scholars. So he says, for example, that when the Quran says towards the end of the ayah, it says dhalika, that is, it's this kind of this demonstrative pronoun, dhalika adna alla ta'ulu, that is so. I'm trying to remember the exact translation, but the idea is that it's referring to this thing, right? And it's not indicating exactly what it is. So Ibn Ashur says that's referring to the previous phrase that says, then marry one. And he says that is what it's referring to when it says that is better so that you will not commit injustice, or will make it less likely for you to commit injustice. And there were other scholars who maybe didn't say it as explicitly, but kind of indicated towards this idea that if you really want to be on the safe side of justice, that one should marry only one. And it was interesting the way they really viewed justice as the central most concern of this verse. They brought up, some of them referenced a prophetic tradition that said, and it kind of, I think, highlights the extent to which they saw justice as being not the institution of polygyny itself, but just like the idea of being just, as the central concern. So they note this hadith, this prophetic tradition that says, if a man has more than one wife and he treats one of them unfairly, that he will arrive on the day of judgment before God with half of his body paralyzed, like because of the fact that he was unequal or unfair. And then also one of the things that I personally sort of struggled with was how to translate this word ma taba lakum. So in the Quran it says, if you fear you will be unjust to orphans, then marry ma taba lakum, those women. I translate it as those women made lawful for you. But if you notice, a lot of translations actually translate it as women who are pleasing to you. But again, engaging with the tafsir literature completely changed the way I viewed this verse, and specifically this phrase, that it wasn't saying marry other women who are pleasing to you, because of course a man is only going to marry presumably someone who is pleasing to him, right? Not someone who's repulsive to him. But rather it's really talking about creating categories of legal prospective spouses versus prospective spouses that are not legal for you, including female orphans.
And I also found it really, your discussion where you're talking about Ibn Ashur's, so his support, his endorsement for the personal status law in the 1956 personal status law, which prohibits polygamy or illegalized polygamy. And then you discuss why, let me see, I'm trying to find that discussion here. Because so in other words, to reconcile his like his interpretation, because he's not saying the Quran is prohibiting it, but he's then supporting a legal prohibition against it. And then you discuss why, that's still it's not a contradiction, because for him it's like a legal authority can prohibit it. But he can't, he can't be like the Quran is prohibiting. But also like, was he a child of a or was his dad a polygamous man? Was that, there was one of the exegetes
So
who,
it was Muhammad Abdo, and I thank you
Abdul.
for mentioning that, because I forgot to mention, this is actually really important, that Muhammad Abdo was the only one of the four modern exegetes who really argues for reforming the law. It's like in his commentary, he argues that polygyny today, the way it's practiced today, creates harm. And he said it's known to all legal scholars that one of the objectives of Sharia is to actually remove harm. And he says that, and he brings forth, he doesn't talk about his own personal background, but he does talk about what he witnesses as a judge. And he says he witnesses all sorts of crimes, and he mentions them, like forgery and murder and theft. He said all of these crimes were a product of, somehow had to do with a polygamous marriage. But then I also know that it was interesting that he also blames the negative effects of polygyny on the co-wife, who breeds like this hatred in her children of the other children, which I found interesting. And it made me kind of wonder, of course, this is all sort of just speculation, but it made me wonder, like, to what extent was this influenced by his own upbringing, because he did come from a polygamous, his father had married more than one wife. Yeah. But with Ibn Ashur, yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, with Ibn Ashur, as you noted, it was sort of this enigma that he stood by Habib Bourguiba when he signed into law the most radical, like, family law reforms in the Arab world, outlawing polygyny. But yeah, in his tafsir, he's very sort of like neutral about it, and in fact, brings up reasons why, what are some of like benefits, for human societies, right? In an attempt to sort of rationalize it. And so I think there were a couple of reasons for his support, and one of which is really supporting the national independence of Tunisia. At that time, it was just, the courts were just gaining their independence from the French. Also, it was, I think, an attempt to sort of preserve the role of religion in the state. Again, these were very, very volatile time periods in the Arab world in specific, with new forms of legislation, new sources of legislation as well, and new sources, just an entire new system, right? Legal system, political system, etc. So it was sort of his way to sort of preserve the role of religion by offering this flexible position. At the same time, in defense of him, the way he approached it was that polygyny is mubah. It's not a fard. Like, polygyny is something that just permissible, but not an obligation. And so therefore the ruler, in his perspective, had the right to abolish something that's just permissible for a greater benefit, for a greater objective, right? So it's not, but when it came to Bourguiba later on trying to ban something that Muslims viewed as obligatory, which is a fasting in Ramadan, he stood up against him, and then he was actually dismissed from his job.
Did any of them read, I'm trying to find my verse on you can never be, okay, for 129. So did anybody read 129 with 4.3 in such a way that they came to the conclusion that 129 is at least implicitly telling us you can never be just, because you're inherently incapable of being just to two wives, your wives equally, therefore polygyny is prohibited. I know somebody, I know at least one of your interpreters did.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm pretty sure if my memory serves me correctly, that Muhammad Abdo mentioned 129. Yeah, because he really does take this strong position against polygyny, and he mentions that it really has to do with a change of time.
So Abduhu says he invokes 129 to say that it's clearly you have to be just to the wives, and because you're not capable of justice to women, therefore it's at least being discouraged. But does anyone actually does anybody come out to say this is an implicit prohibition, not even just a discouragement, this is an implicit prohibition?
From the scholars I looked at, no, none of them none of them look at 429. Well, to be fair though, I don't look at the tafsir of 129. I only look at but I only look at the way it connects to 4.3. But they do mention really this idea that if a man cannot be just, that it is prohibited for him if he's unable to be just. And so that was one of the interesting things in terms of it. It changed the way I viewed, the way pre-modern scholars were really looking at this verse. Like, it wasn't even about polygyny for them. It was about something much greater than polygyny.
And it's the prevention of harm. And that's just, it's so interesting because, I mean, in all the cases that I know of polygyny, they're not preventing harms whatsoever. So it's really ironic and depressing what happens in reality. And then I mistakenly said that for the last verse that we just discussed was your last one in the book, but I know it's 228 or of Al-Baqarah, so 228, the question of the degree that men have over women. I'd love for our readers to at least get a sense of what the divergences are in the different time periods.
Yeah, so you really, in this case, was one of the few cases where Sayyid Qutb's interpretation really stood out in contrast to the other three modern scholars. And he interestingly applies a legal hermeneutic by looking back at the legal context of this entire verse, which is basically describing a legal situation in which a husband has pronounced a unilateral divorce. So the following verse, 229, is when discusses a female initiated divorce, but in this case it's al-mutallaqat, right? So it's those women who have been divorced. So it's really looking at a male initiated unilateral divorce, and it's describing sort of the legal procedures that happen thereafter, which is that there's a waiting period. And what happens in this waiting period? Well, a wife should be forthcoming. She should not conceal whether she's menstruating or whether she's pregnant. And then the husband, during this waiting period, has the right to revoke the divorce that he had pronounced, right? So this is like really important to note, because in Islam, there are revocable divorces and non-revocable divorce. So this verse 228 is referring to revocable divorces. And in fact, this entire category of revocable divorces comes from this verse, because it talks about and their husbands have the greater right, right? And it's really interesting because it uses this form that says the greater right to take them back. And a lot of scholars were saying, okay, the greater right than who? So this is where Sayyid Qutb's interpretation is really interesting, because he says, well, towards the end of the verse, it says, and men, so there's this phrase that says, and women have rights like those against them, and men have a degree above them. Most of the scholars, both pre-modern and modern, are looking at this notion of men's degree as way beyond just the marriage. They will say, it's even beyond just husband and wife. It's sort of the privileges men have, whether socially or legally or ontologically. Not all of them, but to some extent. This was one of the recurring themes that I found. Sayyid Qutb is saying this is not a general precept of men having a degree above women, but this is talking about this very specific situation. Clearly, the man pronounced a divorce, and now he has the right to revoke it. So during this waiting period, when she's in limbo state, he has the upper hand. He has a degree, because if he revokes it, she has to go back to him. Now, what if she doesn't want to go back to him? Well, then she has to initiate a new divorce, a khura. But in this situation, if he revokes the divorce, she has to go back. So then he connects it back to this verbal, not verbal form. It's not the superlative, but remind me, what kind of form is it when it says the greater right, right? Because he's saying, well, here the husband has a greater right than the wife to revoke the divorce. That's what what men's degree is, right? Now, obviously, one can say, well, this is still patriarchal and still unfair. But at the same time, I think if we're to look at this verse atomistically, right, which is a critique that both Asma Barlas and Amna Wadud make, right, that it's not fair to look at these verses in isolation, because then that if we're to look at the Quran intertextually and look at other verses, there are other verses that offset this one, right, that say, well, she cannot be kept in limbo state, right? There are many verses that talk about, do not make things difficult for a wife, just to kind of force her to then initiate a divorce, right? And then it says, and other verses that talk about, keep them in kindness or divorce them in kindness, right? And there's no, so nonetheless, I think obviously this verse is clearly, I mean, talking about a male-initiated divorce. I think in that context, personally, I think Sayyid Qutb's interpretation is much more women-friendly in my assessment. Again, my personal assessment. One can feel free to disagree. In contrast, again, to previous interpretations, right? And I think it's important to think of tafsir as a genealogical tradition, which some scholars like Walid Saleh and others have argued, Johanna Pink among others, Jean McAuliffe, right? That it's building upon previous authorities. And so if we're to look at his interpretation, I think in light of that, it is a much more egalitarian interpretation than thinking of men as just having some sort of, default perpetual privilege over women.
All right, Hadia, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated this, and I know that my readers, listeners will also benefit very much from this interview.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to reading your book. Hopefully it'll be out soon.
Inshallah. All right, bye.